So, thank you, Alan, and thank you everybody at Tor House for inviting us along. It's very moving to be here for me, actually, for reasons which will become clear. We start with a poem. To feel and speak the astonishing beauty of things, earth, stone and water, beast, man and woman, sun, moon and stars, the bloodshot beauty of human nature, its thoughts, frenzies and passions, and unhuman nature, its towering reality. For man's half-dream, man, you might say, is nature dreaming. But rock and water and sky are constant. To feel greatly and understand greatly and express greatly the natural beauty is the sole business of poetry. The rest's diversion. Those holy or noble sentiments, the intricate ideas, the love, lust, longing. Reasons, but not the reason. The sole business of poetry. So, as Alan said, 8 years ago now, I founded the Dark Mountain Project, which was inspired directly by Robertson Jeffers. And tonight, I'm giving my last talk as the director of the Dark Mountain Project. This is very valedictory for me, because I'm stepping back from the Dark Mountain Project later this year, having run it and directed it for 8 years. And the Dark Mountain Project will continue and roll on from strength to strength, but it's time for me to put that in some other hands. So I feel like I've kind of come full circle tonight, and it's rather wonderful. And I'd like to talk about what that means, and I'd like to talk about what Robertson Jeffers means in the context of that. So I had never heard of Robertson Jeffers until 2008, I think, as Alan suggested. And I was reading an anthology of poetry, and I came across, I think, 2 or 3 poems by Jeffers. And I thought, well, I've never heard of him. I wonder what he did. And I read these poems, and they immediately struck me somewhere where poems very rarely do, with this great prophetic power. And what they struck in me particularly was a notion that these poems, this man's work, speak across nearly 100 years of time. 100 years, 80 years, 90 years of time, to where we are now. Because as much as he's a poet, Jeffers is a prophet. He's a prophet of where we are. Because he could see it all coming. And he wrote it down. And he wasn't afraid to write it down. And he wasn't afraid to become deeply unpopular for writing it down. Which in some sections he still remains. Because nobody likes to hear the truth if it's too painful. And this poem in particular, which I have read countless number of times over the last 10 years. Martin's had to sit and listen to me reading this many, many times. I won't do it to you again, Martin. This poem in particular struck with me. This is Rearmament. So this is a poem that Jeffers writes in 1935, 82 years ago. And it's about the rearmament of the United States in preparation for the war, which Jeffers opposed. And he knew the war would be a disaster. Or he thought it would, and he was deeply opposed to it. One of the reasons that he lost his poetic lustre among many people's eyes, that he just refused to accept that America should join this war. And he watched it happening, and he knew he couldn't change it, but he wanted to talk about it anyway. So he writes this: these grand and fatal movements toward death, the grandeur of the mass makes pity a fool, the tearing pity for the atoms of the mass, the persons, the victims, makes it seem monstrous to admire the tragic beauty they build. It is beautiful. As a river flowing, or a slowly gathering glacier, on a high mountain rock face, bound to plough down a forest, or as frost in November, the gold and flaming death dance for leaves, or a girl in the night of her spent maidenhood, bleeding and kissing. I would burn my right hand in a slow fire to change the future. I should do foolishly. The beauty of modern man is not in the persons, but in the disastrous rhythm, the heavy and mobile masses, the dance of the dream-led masses down the dark mountain. The dance of the dream-led masses down the dark mountain. That image stuck with me for 10 years and still does. And I thought, at the time, that's where we are. Now, I'd come out of 10 or 15 years of writing and environmental activism, wanting to turn the tide, trying to turn the tide, as so many people still do, wanting to believe that we could stop the climate from changing, that we could turn around the momentum of this human machine, that we could stop this disastrous rhythm. And at this point, I'd come to believe that we couldn't. And so I was in some despair at the time. I was in some depression. I thought, we're screwed, really. Here we are. And I come across this man, and I come across this poem, and I come across this clear-eyed look at where he was then and where we are now. And I thought, this is a poem about the rearmament of the United States in the 1930s, but it's much more than that. This is a poem about looking very clearly at the rhythm of where we are, where we're going, knowing that, as Alan quoted in the poem we were hearing from just now, great civilizations break down, they rise and they fall, and we're in the falling years, as Jeff has called them now. We're in the falling years. And there may be many good things we can do about that, but we can't change the disastrous rhythm. We can't stop the direction of it. Where does that leave us? That was the question I wanted to ask. Where does that leave us? Well, you might have seen the news last week, the trillion-ton iceberg that carved off Antarctica. It's kind of common news, that kind of thing now. We don't even take much notice of it. Trillion-ton icebergs are carving off the Antarctic every few months. We've had a record hot summer where I live in Ireland this year. Not so far away from Yeats's tower. Not so far away from me. The tower that in part inspired the construction of Hawke Tower here. There is more carbon in the atmosphere today than at any time since humans first evolved. We're in the middle of a 6th mass extinction event. You probably know that already. Only this time around, humans are playing the role of the meteor from outer space. And climate change is moving much faster than we thought even a decade ago. I'm struck by what Professor John Schellenhuber says about this. He's one of the world's leading climatologists. We're looking now at the possibility of 4 degrees of climate change, maybe even in the next century or so, above current levels. Schellenhuber says the difference between 3 degrees of warming and 4 degrees of warming is human civilization. He's a scientist. He's very cautious about such things. And it's almost as if, isn't it, that we can't actually predict or control how the planet behaves after all. It's almost as if we're not in charge. Almost as if we don't know what we're doing. Which Jeff was very clearly pointing at for a very long time. This is what D.H. Lawrence says in 1924, contemporary of Jeff, as the universe is not a machine after all, it's alive and kicking. And in spite of the fact that man, with all his cleverness, has discovered some habits of our old earth and so lured him into a trap, in spite of the fact that man has trapped the great forces, and they go round and round at his bidding like a donkey in a gin, the old demon isn't quite nabbed. We didn't quite catch him napping. He'll turn into a python, coiling, coiling, coiling until we're nicely mashed, and then he'll bolt us. Here we are. So here we are, 82 years after Jeffers' rights rearmament, facing the consequences of their own cleverness, of our own cleverness. Jeff has said that humanity was a species in the process of breaking its legs on its own cleverness, which is a lovely phrase. So 82 years ago, this is what Jeffers writes. And this prophetic urgency and this poetic urgency, in Jeffers' words, is what drew me to him. I thought, here is a man who, died 7 years before I was born, and he could see what was coming. And he was dedicated to telling it like it is, regardless of whether anybody wanted to hear it, which many of them didn't. And I still have never come across a voice like Jeffers. There isn't another voice like Jeffers, actually, in poetry. There are some voices which are instantly recognisable in poetry or prose, and no one else could be that person. Lawrence is one of them. You read a sentence from D.H. Lawrence, no one else could have written that. And Jeffers is another one. No one else would write this. Never be astonished, dear. Expect change. Nothing is strange. We have seen the human race capture all its dreams, all except peace. We have watched mankind like Christ toil up and up to be hanged at the top. These are the falling years. They will go deep. Never weep. Never weep. And that's the other thing about Jeffers. Because Jeffers doesn't just say, look at this. Look at where we are. He says, it's okay. It's okay, just sit with it. There it is. It's not pleasant, but you don't have to weep. So the Dark Mountain Project began as an attempt to rise to this challenge that Jeff has laid down so many years ago, and to ask, can we write today with some poetic urgency and some prophetic urgency about the disastrous rhythm of our times, about the extinction, about the ecocide, about the climate change? Can we write and behave and speak and live as if this were really true, as if we really believed it? How would you live? How would you act if you really believed that nothing is the same after this point? That everything that you've grown up to believe is eternal is not eternal? That much that you take for granted is going to fall away for yourself and your children? How do you deal with that? And I thought Dark Mountain would be maybe 10 writers meeting in a pub. You know, a bit like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, sitting in the pub talking about orcs and how to write fantasy books. But it got rather bigger than that. And I've had to kind of run to keep up, which is one reason it's nice to step back and just watch it happening now and occasionally dip my toes in, which is what I plan to do from now on, because I've spent 8 years accidentally curating rather a large global network of thousands of writers and artists, producing 2 anthologies every year, running festivals, running courses, coming together with people like Martin to bring the work into directions where I'd never imagined they would go in, and learning a huge amount myself in the process. This happened not because we had said something that no one else had thought of, but precisely because we'd said something that a lot of other people were already thinking. Actually, we just gave them permission to say it. You raise a flag and people start gathering around it, because you discover when you talk about this that there's a lot of frightened people around. There's a lot of people looking at this as well and saying, I don't know what to do about this. I don't know what to do about this disastrous rhythm. And you find there are a lot of people, who knows, maybe most of us, who've stopped believing the stories that they're being told by their countries, by their governments, by their leaders, maybe by themselves. These stories of endless progress, these stories of human centrality, these stories of our ability to control nature, of the inevitable improvement of everything due to our technological and scientific genius. That's the story of progress, the story of eternal growth. And a lot of people don't believe it because it's turning out not to be true. Where does that leave you? Where does that leave you? And that's the question that Jeff has asked. And that's the question he tries to create a new kind of poetry to explore. Because that's the other thing I admired about Jeff, is there isn't anyone else writing in this form. He's created his own poetic form, which mirrors the rhythms of nature in the lines that he creates, and in the way that you sit up there on the rocks and you listen to the sea, and you can see where the lines come from. You can see where this great, vast, endless rhythm of lines, these lines that go on for so long that they have to be broken up into 3 or 4 lines on the page because you can't fit them across. It's the rhythm of the sea, it's the rhythm of the wind, it's the rhythm of the rocks. And I wonder what kind of thing Jeff has thought he was doing, because he's one of these people who resolutely refuses to join any gang that would have him. I wrote a novel which was published in the States just last week, and it's called Beast. And it was reviewed in the London Review of Books, and they described my style as a kind of ancient modernism, which I loved. I didn't know that's what I did, but it is apparently what I do, and I wish I'd come up with that myself. I might put it on a T-shirt. I thought that was great, ancient modernism, and I thought about this, and I thought, what does that mean? What does that mean, ancient modernism? So Jeffers is writing during the high tide of modernism, really. And what is modernism? It's the process of breaking down traditional forms because they don't work anymore. It's the process of challenging the ways of seeing and the ways of representing the world in words and trying to do something that's more relevant. Off breaking out of traditional restrictions. But the question I always have about modernism is, what is it in service to? What's it in service to? What does it offer in place of what it's broken? It's always the question for me. And I don't just mean about poetry either, I mean about everything that the modern project offers. When it breaks down every traditional form, when it breaks down every natural form, every ecological form, what does it give us instead? What does it give us instead? Sometimes it gives us this exhaustive narrative of progress, better living through science and reason. Sometimes it just gives us nihilism. It doesn't give us anything at all. And it looks to me like what Jeffers is doing is trying to break down these traditional forms in service to something bigger. In service to the wind, in service to the rocks, in service to the sea, in service to the whole. Not man apart from that, he says, not man apart from that. We're not apart. It says one thing Jeffers says for 50 years is, we are not separate. We are not separate from everything else that lives. And the fact that we think we are is what is destroying us. So what is destroying us? That's not a modern message. That's the message of every indigenous culture that's ever lived. That's the message that 99% of humanity has always understood, for 99% of our history. And it's interesting, isn't it, that today is regarded as such a ridiculous message that only recluses who live in towers by the sea are the kind of people who say it. But we're having to learn the hard way that it was right. We're having to learn the hard way that it was right. So Jeffers is writing after the cataclysm of the First World War destroys everything that the West thinks it knows about itself. And we're still living the consequences of that. And you see him breaking down traditional forms in the 20s and the 30s, but not with any modernist intention, with some other kind of intention. And that's another reason I find Jeffers so interesting, because he's not a progressive. He's not a progressive. And I don't just mean that in the sense that that word is used today to mean someone a little bit left-wing. I mean, he doesn't believe in the narrative of progress. He doesn't believe that humanity started off ignorant, grunting in caves, and will end up conquering the universe. That it's a linear progression through time. That our science and our genius will inevitably lead us to be conquistadors. He knows it isn't true. He knows it isn't true. That's the big story of modernity, which is hitting the rocks at the moment. And one of the central claims of the Dark Mountain Project was and is that everything we know is a story. Every culture, every civilization tells itself stories about its relationship to the earth, about its relationship to each other. From the smallest tribe to the biggest civilization, we all have stories that we mistake for reality. And our story is the story of progress, of human separateness, of our superiority to other creatures. That's the story of progress, but Jeffers says, that's not a promise, that's a trap. That's a trap, and we're caught in the trap. And in this fantastic poem, The Purse Seine, which I bet you've all read, it's wonderful. He compares the story of progress, he compares the gathering rhythm and the giant cities and the momentum of industrialisation to a fishing net, a purse seine fishing net which slowly draws in its prey. And he looks out from the mountains, presumably one of the mountains around here, at the purse seine fishing net gathering around the shoals of the mackerel and then drawing them up like a giant bag, and the mackerel can do nothing but flap as the bag tightens. And then he writes this: lately I was looking from a night mountain top on a wide city, the coloured splendour, galaxies of light. How could I help but recall the seine net, gathering the luminous fish? I cannot tell you how beautiful the city appeared, and a little terrible. I thought, we have geared the machines and locked all together into interdependence. We have built the great cities. Now there is no escape. We have gathered vast populations, incapable of free survival, insulated from the strong earth, each person in himself helpless, on all dependent. The circle is closed and the net is being hauled in. Whew. Now, I don't know about you, but when I offer a perspective like this, it tends not to be very popular. Because nobody wants to see themselves as a sardine in a net. Nobody wants to be a sardine in a net. We want to be free individuals. We want to be the heroes in our own story. And so to oppose this story, to oppose the story of progress, is to be a misanthrope, or a depressive, or a reactionary, or to be suffering from despair or delusion or self-hatred. And when we started the Dark Mountain Project, we got called a wonderful collection of names by people, actually. It was good. We got called all of those things. I was told I needed to be quiet and just have some pills, because clearly I had mental health issues which should not be resolved on the page. And I was told I was being irresponsible for saying these things, because people will be depressed and they won't do the necessary work to change the world. The best name we got called was Crazy Collapsitarians. Crazy Collapsitarian. It's another thing to put on a t-shirt, actually. I am a crazy collapsitarian. And that's fair enough. I understand why, because everybody needs a story and they don't like to see their story demolished. And often people ask me probably what they would ask Jeffers as well. And sometimes they still do ask about Jeffers' poetry. Where's the hope? They say, where's the hope? Where's the hope? And what they're really saying is, who's going to save me? Where is my saviour? Who will come and tell me what to do? Who will come and give me some easy answers? And the answer is, there are a lot of people who will do that. But do you want to listen to them? What if the thing to do actually is just sit with the reality that there is no saviour? And that's okay. Because as we put it in the Dark Mountain Manifesto, the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world full stop. And as Jeffers says, great civilizations have risen and fallen many times before. Humans are still here. The earth is still here. We've had 5 mass extinctions already. Here's another one. It's not easy. It's not necessarily good, but it's not necessarily bad either. It's where we are, and we have to live through it. And that's Jeffers' answer, not to be deluded by dreams. And people confuse that with despair or nihilism and giving up, but it isn't. It's a clear-eyed, honest assessment of where we are. That's all. And one of the things also we discovered at Dark Mountain, and so many other people have discovered, is that when you accept that, it's a huge weight off your shoulders. It's a huge weight off your shoulders. When you don't have to save the world single-handedly, when you don't have to try and do the impossible, then you can start asking, well, what can I do that's possible? What can I do that's possible? Because there's plenty you can do. And Jeffers' philosophy of inhumanism, which he lays out in the foreword to the collection The Double Axe, which is probably the collection that destroyed his reputation more than any others amongst those who wanted to be given a saviour. This foreshadows the radicalism of deep ecology and the more realistic and honest aspects of the green movement by about 40 years. And Jeffers calls for this. He calls for a shifting of emphasis and significance from man to not man, the rejection of human solipsism and recognition of the transhuman magnificence. It seems time, he says, that our race began to think as an adult does, rather than like an egocentric baby or insane person. This manner of thought and feeling is neither misanthropic nor pessimist, though 2 or 3 people have said so and may again. More than 2 or 3 in my view. It offers a reasonable detachment as a rule of conduct instead of love, hate and envy. It neutralises fanaticism and wild hopes, but it provides magnificence for the religious instinct and satisfies our need to admire greatness and rejoice in beauty. Now, I think that's rather a good philosophical statement of our times, though I think it could do with being renamed. I'm not sure inhumanism is going to be publicly appealing. It's not what you want on a t-shirt. But the reason it's not greatly appealing, actually, is that it denies the human ego its central place in the story. And what Jeffers is saying is not humans don't matter, humans aren't important, there's something wrong with humans. He's just saying we're just one creature amongst many others. We're part of something bigger. And that's a glorious thing. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's more likely that you should be ashamed of imagining that you're the centre of things, that you're somehow separate from everything else. And the point of view which tells us that humans are separate or distinct or superior to every other creature on earth isn't science, it's ideology. It's almost religion. And what Jeffers does is he takes us back to the pre-modern notion that humans aren't at the centre of the world. And perhaps that's the central teaching of modernity. Mankind bestrides everything. And perhaps that's the story of our times that we have to learn is wrong. And perhaps that's what we have to do as we watch The Disastrous Rhythm. Understand that that story was wrong. And think of a better one. Discover a better one. Rediscover a better one. Lift the burden, if that happens. And Jeffers saw it. Jeffers sees all this. He can see where that story is taking us. Jeffers' central power to me is to identify the incorrect, the wrong, the toxic story that we live by. That humans are the centre of the world. And we can control and manage it for our own destiny. And he could see what would happen. So here's something he wrote, a little poem, a snatch of a poem that he wrote during the last years of his life. In this house, of course. About this house. He writes, this is in, I think, the early 60s or the late 50s. The polar ice caps are melting. The mountain glaciers drip into rivers. All feed the ocean. Tides ebb and flow, but every year a little bit higher. They will drown New York. They will drown London. And this place, where I have planted trees and built a stone house, will be under sea. The poor trees will perish, and little fish will flicker in and out of the windows. There you go. Hasn't happened yet, but there's still time. People are born and die. Civilizations and cultures born and die. Planets are born and die. And as for beauty, Jeffers tells us again and again, beauty isn't the creation of people. Perhaps the central duty of people, perhaps one of the new stories to replace that toxic story of power and human empire, is the intrinsic nature of beauty, the beauty of things that was born before eyes. And Jeffers says you can press down and erase and destroy as much beauty as you want, but it always rises again. Always rises again. Here's another poem I really love from Jeffers. And it was so interesting to drive here today. From Point Reyes, Martin and I drove down from Point Reyes. And I don't know how long it took us to drive through the kind of suburbs here and find the house. There are so many little windy roads. And this place is so small compared to all the houses around it. And to look at that, obviously, and compare it to the photographs you see of what this place was like when it was built. This great, wide, trackless, beautiful expanse of cliff and trees and these wild beaches. And Jeffers, obviously, in his lifetime, has to watch this stuff growing up around him. He's tried to be a recluse on the cliff and it's all gone horribly wrong. He's surrounded by suburbs. No, it's just terrible. But again, he tries to be inhumanist about it. He tries to have some perspective. And he writes, the extraordinary patience of things, of the way Jeffers uses the word things all the time, the extraordinary patience of things, this beautiful place defaced with a crop of suburban houses. How beautiful when we first beheld it, unbroken field of poppy and lupin, walled with clean cliffs. No intrusion but 2 or 3 horses pasturing or a few milch cows rubbing their flanks on the outcrop rockhead. Now the spoiler has come. Does it care? Not faintly. It has all time. It knows the people are a tide that swells and in time will ebb, and all their works dissolve. Meanwhile, the image of the pristine beauty lives in the very grain of the granite, safe as the endless ocean that climbs our cliff. As for us, we must uncentre our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and ocean that we were made from. Again, philosophy for our times. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and ocean that we were made from. But one of the other things I like about Jeffers is he's not always that calm. Sometimes he just can't help himself. Sometimes he just can't help telling us all how pissed he is about the whole thing. And some of his later poems, particularly in the Double Axe, which is probably the angriest collection of poems I've ever read about anything, he can't help letting his misanthropy out of the box. He calls humans the man-brained and man-handed ground ape, physically the most repulsive of all hot-blooded animals up to that time of the world. Really terrible poem about early humans burning a mammoth to death. And that's how it's called original sin, by the way. Sometimes you can feel Jeffers' father come through in his poems, can't you? This demonic Christian preacher. He likes that. He likes to stand on the cliffs and preach sometimes, Jeffers. And he writes, these are the people, this is the human dawn. As for me, I would rather be a worm in a wild apple than a son of man. But we are what we are. And we might remember not to hate any person, for all are vicious, and not be astonished at any evil, all are deserved, and not fear death, it is the only way to be cleansed. And I read that poem and I think, well, really, Robinson? Are all people really vicious? Is all evil really deserved? Is there really no way to be cleansed except death? And what does cleansed mean anyway? And I like that, because he's kind of being honest about how he feels sometimes. And it's difficult to look at the state of the world and not feel like that sometimes. And I have to admit that I do. He looks at what humans are doing, and he doesn't much like it. But he knows he's a human, and he's part of the problem. But he also saves himself from these moments of misanthropy with this timeless vision of the cycles of time, with this notion, which was informed by his brother Hamilton, who was an astronomer, that everything is so old, everything is so deep. It comes back again, and the beauty is still in the granite. The image of the beauty is still there. And it's so fascinating the way Jeffers deals with the notion of beauty as something intrinsic, almost as if it's a living thing. It's not just a human perception. It's something nature has, And it's always there. It doesn't matter how much we cover it in tarmac. It's always there. And it comes back again. And it's interesting to me to watch my own reaction to Jeffers changing over the years, because when I first read Jeffers, as I said, I was drawn to this kind of stark, prophetic hawk on a cliff looking down at humanity and telling us just how screwed we were, because you don't see that very often. And somebody has to say it, that kind of rugged honesty in the face of the wider culture. But I notice that when I read Jeffers now, I'm drawn less to that, and I'm drawn more to the reflective passages in which he writes about beauty, in which he has this animistic vision of the living earth, of which he's part, not man apart. He is the earth. He is the rock. He is the hawk. He is the cliff. And as he writes, if you come back to this place in several generations, everything will be changed here. And he says, my ghost you needn't look for, because it might be here, but it'll be deep in the grain of the granite. A dark ghost, he says. He's quite aware of his reputation. Deep in the grain of the granite. This kind of conversation that he always has with the rest of nature. And again, when I look at the task that we have ahead of us now, the task is to look for different stories. To look for different stories to replace this toxic big story of modernity and our imperial power. And one of the stories for me is that we've forgotten how to have a conversation with the rest of nature. We've forgotten how to listen to it. And we've forgotten how to talk back to it, to speak to it, to have a relationship with it. You know, Dostoevsky says, beauty will save the world. Beauty will save the world. It's a great line, and I think Jeffers would have agreed with it. And another way of putting that is that we require a return to perhaps the vision of our ancestors, that the earth is alive. Like Lawrence says, it's not a machine. The universe is not a machine. It's alive and kicking. And the earth is alive and kicking. And if you think that it isn't, it's because you're not listening. And if you behave like it isn't, you're going to get into trouble. You're going to get into trouble. That we're in relationship with everything else. And we've forgotten it. We've forgotten it. And now we're going to be taught that it's still true, whether we like it or not. And here we are. And I like, now, when I read Jeffers, to read about how he listens and how he speaks to the rest of nature. Maybe this is my favourite part of any of his poems. This is a short extract from his longer poem, The Tower Beyond Tragedy. It's so good. It's wonderful. I entered the life of the brown forest and the great life of the ancient peaks, the patience of stone. And I felt the changes in the veins in the throat of the mountain. And I was the streams draining the mountain wood. And I the stag drinking, and I was the stars boiling with light, wandering alone, each one the lord of his own summit, and I was the darkness outside the stars. I included them. They were part of me. And then he asks, how can I express the excellence I have found? How can I express the excellence I have found? This moment in the brown forest, in which he is everything. He's listening. He just is everything. He's not man apart. He's human, all right, but he's a human animal. And that's how Jeffers listens. This is how Jeffers speaks. He says, the water is the water, the cliff is the rock, come shocks and flashes of reality, the mind passes, the eye closes, the spirit is a passage. The beauty of things was born before eyes and sufficient to itself. The heart-breaking beauty will remain when there is no heart to break for it. A heartbreaking beauty will remain when there's no heart to break for it. And I wonder if that's what I'll take away with me from this place. Because I wanted to visit this place for nearly 10 years now. And I never thought I'd manage it. And I certainly never thought I'd be asked to come and talk here. And it feels like an honour. And like I say, it feels like something has come full circle. It feels like it's nice to come and give something back, having stolen so much of Jeffers for the Dark Mountain Project without his permission at all. I've no idea what he would have thought of it. He would have probably been disgusted by the whole thing. He didn't like joining organisations. I don't know. But he knew about that. Coming full circle. And I'm just going to leave you now with what Jeffers said to the Library of Congress when he spoke to them in 1941. As war raged across the world, and it seemed to fitting into my journey, and it seems to fitting into the journey we're still on now. Jeffers tries to explain what he's really doing and what he's about. He says this: I have heard myself called a pessimist, he says. And perhaps I've written some words of ill omen in my books of verses, and perhaps I've spoken tonight some words of ill omen, but they're not words of despair. If we conjecture the decline and fall of this civilization, it's because we hope for a better one. We're a tough race, we human beings. We've lived through an ice age and many ages of barbarism. We can live through this age of civilization. And when at length it wears out and crumbles under us, we can plot our agony of resurrection and make a new age. Our business is to live through anything, and to keep alive through everything our ideal values of freedom and courage and mercy and tolerance. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you, Lord.